black woman in her 70s stands quietly at airport security holding a small silver urn, but then a TSA officer yells at her in front of everyone, accusing her of smuggling drugs. Just 12 minutes later, the officer is crying, and the entire terminal gives her a standing ovation. What happened next will restore your faith in humanity. Before we start the story, let me ask you something. Have you ever seen someone treated unfairly at an airport? Comment below if you have, and let's talk about it. Now stay with me, because this is a story you'll remember the next time you see an old woman standing alone with her memories. It was just an ordinary morning. She walked slowly through the glass doors of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, her steps careful, her grip tight around a worn leather handbag, and a small metal urn no bigger than a coffee mug. She wasn't in a rush. There was nothing urgent to return to except a cemetery in Alabama where she and her husband had promised they'd rest side by side. She had made that promise 42 years ago. And now she was keeping it. He had passed in the fall, just as the leaves turned brown and brittle like the bones in his hand when she held it for the last time in the hospital. Her name was Marian, and you'd probably walk right past her. She wasn't loud, didn't dress flashy, and if you blinked you might think she was just another tired old lady catching a flight back to some quiet southern town. But that morning she carried more than luggage. She carried love, she carried war, she carried grief and memory, and 51 years of marriage reduced to fine gray dust. Marian didn't travel much anymore. She'd given up driving 2 years ago after her vision started to fade a bit. But this flight, she wouldn't miss. Her husband's remains were going home to the town where they'd met, and where he'd first told her he wanted to marry her back in 1963 on the back porch of his mama's house. Back then they couldn't sit at the front of the bus, let alone walk through airport security without side eyes. But now she was here alone, holding what was left of the only man who ever knew how to hold her right. The TSA line was long. People sighed impatiently, everyone in a hurry to go somewhere, while Marian just wanted to arrive slowly, peacefully. She moved forward inch by inch, her turn coming up. She held the urn with both hands, cradling it like a newborn. The TSA agent was young, white, tall, with a crew cut and eyes that didn't blink much. He glanced at her, then back at the screen as her bag went through the conveyor belt. His brow furrowed. "Ma'am," he said sharply, motioning for her to step aside. Marian looked up, surprised, unsure what was wrong. "What's that?" he asked, pointing at the urn in her hands. "This," she said gently, lifting it slightly. "It's my husband." There was a pause, just long enough for a few people nearby to turn their heads. Then he frowned deeper. "I need to inspect that item," he said louder. "It's just ashes," she said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "Step aside now," he said again, this time louder and firmer. She did as she was told, confusion in her eyes, and something else too, something older, something bone-deep. "Tired. We have an unknown metallic object, possibly containing powder," he called out to a colleague. People started to stare. One woman looked over and whispered to her child. Another man pulled out his phone and began recording. Marian felt a flush rise up her neck. It had been years since she'd felt that familiar heat, the one that came when people looked at her not as a person but as a threat. "I told you, it's my husband's ashes," she said again, this time louder, more urgent, but her voice cracked. "We'll see about that," the officer said, and took the urn from her hands roughly, not cruelly perhaps, but without reverence, without understanding, without permission. She gasped, not because he might drop it, but because it was the last thing she had that felt sacred, and now it was in the hands of someone who didn't know what it meant. "You can't just take him from me like that," she said, her voice trembling. "Ma'am, please calm down," he replied. "This is standard procedure." But it wasn't standard. Nothing about this was standard. She stood there, hands empty, heart pounding, air thick with humiliation, as if someone had just torn open her chest and put her grief on public display. A few feet away, a family of tourists looked on amused. A boy giggled. The father whispered something that sounded like overreacting, and Marian just stood there, shrinking smaller with each breath, wondering how in this moment she had become a suspect instead of a widow, a security threat instead of a grieving wife. And then something happened, something subtle but monumental. An older man, perhaps mid-70s, stepped out from the line, his hair white, his face worn, not unlike the photo Marian kept in her wallet of her husband in his later years. He looked at her, looked at the TSA officer, and then said quietly but clearly, "Is your name Marian Williams?" Her eyes widened. "Yes," she said cautiously. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something deeply personal. "Your husband was Corporal David Williams?" he asked again. "Yes," she repeated, and now her voice wasn't just cautious, it was breaking. "He saved my life in '69 in the Mekong Delta," the man said, and in that moment the entire terminal changed. People stopped shuffling, they leaned in, TSA agents froze, and Marian swayed on her feet. "I remember his face," the man continued. "He pulled me out when the ambush hit. He took a bullet for me. I never got to thank him." The TSA officer looked between them, confused, uncertain. This wasn't in his manual, this wasn't part of his training. The older man turned to him and said evenly but firmly, "You just disrespected the ashes of a man who died for this country and the woman who stood by him for 5 decades." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Marian looked down at her hands, still empty, and tears began to fall, not just because of what had just happened, but because someone remembered someone knew. The TSA officer's expression changed slowly from confusion to realization to something that looked an awful lot like shame. He turned to Marian, opened his mouth, but no words came. Instead, he handed the urn back carefully, this time gently, his hands shaking. I'm sorry, ma'am, he said, but it was too late for apologies, too late for procedures. And then someone in the crowd began to clap, one person, then two, then the sound grew and rose, and soon the entire terminal was clapping, not just for her, not just for David, but for something older than both of them, something buried but not forgotten. Marian didn't smile, she didn't bow, she just held the urn to her chest and nodded once as if to say, yes, I still carry him, and now you carry this moment too. And in that clap, in that beat between humiliation and recognition, something shifted, not just in the airport, but perhaps in the hearts of those who watched it happen. So I ask you again, have you seen someone treated unfairly at an airport? Because this time, the woman who stood quietly didn't stay invisible, and neither did her story. Marian hadn't always been the quiet type. Once, decades ago, she had a laugh that rolled like thunder through church halls and neighborhood porches. Back when she and David used to dance in their small living room to Sam Cooke playing on a dusty radio. Back when her knees didn't ache and her voice didn't tremble. The woman standing at gate 12 with a tear drying on her cheek was not just someone's grandmother. She was someone's whole world. Once. Before her hands shook when tying her shoes. Before strangers looked through her like furniture. Before America decided that older meant invisible. That morning, as she waited for her boarding group to be called, Marian clutched the silver urn again, now held with reverence by every eye in the terminal, and settled into one of those stiff black chairs that line the gates like polite apologies. Her hands, weathered and brown, rested gently on the urn's smooth surface, fingers tracing invisible rings like she used to do on David's wedding band when he fell asleep on the couch. A boy nearby asked his mother in a whisper loud enough to echo, "What's in that?" The mother shushed him, but Marian turned slightly and offered a soft smile, the kind that invites rather than silences. "That's my husband," she said simply. The mother's eyes widened, unsure whether to apologize or comfort, but Marian turned back to the window, not needing either. Outside, a plane taxied lazily across the tarmac, dragging shadows in its wake like old regrets. Marian's flight was delayed 30 minutes, something about a maintenance issue. Nobody was thrilled. People muttered. Phones were pulled out like weapons against boredom. A man 2 seats down kept swiping angrily through headlines, eyes burning with the exhaustion of another day too long and too full of nothing important. She didn't mind the delay. It gave her time. Not that she had much left, but what she had was precious. Time to remember. Time to carry him a little longer. You have to understand, this trip wasn't just about ashes and goodbyes. It was about a promise made in a kitchen during a thunderstorm in 1967, when Marian told David she'd never leave him, even if he left first. "And when I go," he said with his wide, crooked grin, "just take me home, baby. Don't let them keep me in no city I didn't choose." She'd laughed then, young and bold, and said, "Ain't nobody keeping us anywhere we don't want to be." It was the kind of promise people make when they still believe they have 50 years left to keep it. And somehow they did. David had been born in Montgomery, drafted at 21, came home at 25 with a limp and eyes that saw too much. He didn't talk much about Vietnam, except in quiet half-sentences over coffee when the news played footage he couldn't ignore. "We lost some good ones," he'd say, then stare at his hands as if wondering why they'd come home when others didn't. Marian had seen what the war took, not just from him but from the other boys who came back to their neighborhood different, quieter, jumpier. Some turned to drinking, some turned to God. David turned to her. He built tables in the garage, raised their 2 sons, cried once, just once, when his youngest left for college. She never expected to outlive him. He was always the strong one. Even when cancer came creeping like smoke under a door, he'd joke with the nurses and flirt with the techs like it wasn't trying to kill him. When he lost his hair, he made her shave her head too, and they wore matching beanies in the living room and laughed until they cried. So when he passed that October night, Marian sat next to the hospital bed long after they had turned off the machines. She held his hand for hours, whispering old stories into the hush. "Don't worry," she told him. "I'm taking you home." She hadn't counted on the urn being a problem. Nobody told her you could be stopped at security for carrying what was left of your life. She'd read the TSA guidelines carefully. She had documentation. She called the airline ahead of time. But none of that mattered when someone looked at your skin and your silence and made assumptions. Now, as the intercom crackled and her boarding group was finally called, Marian stood slowly, smoothing the wrinkles in her coat with practiced grace. The urn stayed close to her chest as she moved forward, step by deliberate step, toward the gate agent. A younger agent with a badge reading Sims met her eyes, then looked away quickly like he was embarrassed to hold them too long. "Ma'am," he said, "they've asked me to personally escort you on board." She raised an eyebrow. "Is that right?" He nodded, clearing his throat. "Yes, ma'am. The captain wanted you to board early. Said he heard what happened at security." Marian didn't say thank you. Not out of rudeness, but because some apologies come too late to be named. Still, she followed him down the jet bridge. The plane felt cold, like they always do, and the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant hit her before anything else. The first officer met her at the door, tipped his head like a soldier would to another. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Williams. I'm sorry for your loss." She nodded. "Thank you. Would you like to sit in the front row?" "I'd like to sit where my ticket says I should," she said, voice steady. "But thank you kindly." He paused, then smiled. "Yes, ma'am." She settled into her seat. Window just as David liked. "You see everything better from the side," he used to say. As the rest of the passengers filed in, eyes flicked toward her, and though most didn't say anything, a few offered quiet nods. One woman reached out and touched Marian's arm. "He must have been someone special." "He was," Marian said, looking down at the urn. "Still is." The plane filled. The engines hummed. The flight attendants made their announcements. And Marian sat back, holding David to her chest, whispering, "We're almost there." But she wasn't thinking about the cemetery anymore, or the plaque with his name, or the preacher waiting to say a few final words. She was thinking about all the moments she'd lived in the quiet, the kindnesses unseen, the hands held, the fights survived, the laughter that no one recorded. She was thinking about how easily people dismiss the old, how one shout in an airport could unravel 75 years of dignity. And she was thinking about every man who ever looked at her and didn't see his mother, didn't see his wife, didn't see his future. And if you, reading this now, ever find yourself behind a woman like Marian in line, wondering why she moves so slow, why she holds something so close to her heart, maybe just ask. Maybe just see her. Because sometimes the people we ignore are the ones holding the whole damn story. The plane had barely lifted off the runway when Marian closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to remember. She wasn't tired, her body was sure, but her mind was electric, awake in a way it hadn't been in years. The hum of the engines, the gentle pressure of ascent, they didn't frighten her. She had lived through too many storms, too many farewells, too many late-night knocks on the door that carried news heavy enough to break bones. A little turbulence didn't scare her. What did unsettle her now, though, was the sense that she'd become a story people would tell. A symbol, a headline on someone else's timeline. She didn't want to be a moment of viral shame for a government agency. She wanted to be a woman going home with her husband. That was all. The man in the seat next to her wore a cap that read US Navy Retired. He hadn't said much when he sat down. Just a quiet ma'am and a nod. But now, after a few minutes of silence and altitude, he turned slightly and said, "He in there?" Marian opened her eyes and looked at him. She didn't answer right away. There was something sacred about that question. Something soft. "Yes," she said. "My husband, David." The man nodded once. "Army," she added. Not because she had to, but because David always made her proud. "Vietnam." "I figured," the man replied. "You don't hold nothing like that unless it's earned." Marian let out a small breath, half a laugh. "He earned every bit of it." They didn't talk much more after that, but the silence felt companionable, not awkward. A silence shared by people who'd both seen too much to fill the air with nonsense. The flight attendant came by, offered water, peanuts, smiles. Marian declined. She wasn't hungry, and she sure as hell wasn't thirsty. What she was remembering. It was strange what airports did to people. How they turned everyone into ghosts, half here, half already somewhere else. She looked around the cabin, at the rows of tired travelers, and she wondered how many were carrying grief. Not the kind that came with tears and casseroles, but the quiet kind. The kind that sat heavy in your bones and made you forget why you walked into a room. Somewhere over Tennessee, the pilot announced they'd be landing early due to favorable tailwinds. Marian looked down at the urn in her lap. "Looks like we'll be home sooner than we thought," she whispered. And just like that, a memory came rushing in, sharp, vivid, like it had been waiting for just this moment to be recalled. She was 38, and David had just missed his train coming back from a construction job in Macon. No cell phones then, no way to track where he was. She'd stood on the station platform, heart pounding, convinced something had gone wrong. He arrived 2 hours later on the next train, covered in dust, smiling like a fool. "Baby, the wind was with us," he said. "Got us there faster than expected." She'd been so mad she didn't talk to him for a whole day. But at night, when he wrapped his arms around her, she forgave him. Because he always came home. Until he didn't. The landing came smooth and uneventful. The captain thanked them all, wished them a good day, and added a quiet line at the end. "To those traveling for love or loss, may your journey bring you peace." It was a small thing, but it struck Marian deeply. Someone somewhere had told him. Maybe the first officer. Maybe the ground crew. Maybe the video had spread already. But someone knew she wasn't just a passenger. She was a keeper of memory. And today, memory flew first class. As she stood up to deplane, the Navy veteran stepped back to let her go first. "You go ahead," he said gently. "You've waited long enough." Marian smiled, grateful. The walk down the jet bridge was slow, but steady. At the gate, a young man in a pressed suit held a sign with her name. "Mrs. Williams?" he asked. "I'm here to drive you to the cemetery." She nodded. "You with the VA?" "Yes, ma'am. We were notified this morning. Full honors as per request. We have the flag ready, and a small detail waiting." "You didn't have to do all that," she said. He wouldn't have wanted a fuss. The young man smiled. "Well, we think he earned it." The car ride was quiet. Marian sat in the back, urn on her lap, watching the world blur past the window. Georgia faded into Alabama like the years between childhood and womanhood. Soft transitions you didn't notice until the scenery changed completely. They passed gas stations she remembered as fields, and billboards advertising churches she once helped clean as a girl. This was where they had built their beginning, where David first touched her hand beneath a dogwood tree and said, "If I don't come back from this war, you find someone who'll love you better than I do." She never had to. The cemetery wasn't grand. It didn't have marble angels or fountains. Just rows of stones, a breeze, and silence so deep it made you whisper without realizing it. The VA detail was already there. 2 young soldiers in uniform, 1 older sergeant who walked with a cane. As she stepped out of the car, they straightened. She nodded, said nothing. They didn't need words. The honor guard took the urn with reverence. The flag was folded slowly, crisply, like ritual. The bugle played softly. No theatrics, no loud salutes, just that clean, aching sound that always made her throat tighten. When the flag was presented to her, the young soldier's hand trembled slightly. "On behalf of the United States Army and a grateful nation," he said, "we present this flag to you in memory of your husband's faithful service." She accepted it, her hand steady even if her heart wasn't. After they left, after the driver returned to wait in the car, Marian sat alone on the bench beside the grave. She didn't say much, just leaned in close and said, "You're home now, David. I kept my promise." She stayed like that for a long while, not crying, not praying, just being, just holding space for a life that deserved remembering. When she finally rose to leave, a breeze lifted the hem of her coat. She looked up at the sky, a soft blue smeared with wisps of cloud. "I hope," she whispered, They see us now. I hope they understand. And then, with deliberate grace, she walked back to the car. Past the young soldiers. Past the headstones. Past the decades that had both scarred and shaped her. Not broken. Not bitter. But changed. And if anyone had been watching, they'd have seen something quiet but unmistakable in her step. A kind of victory. Not the kind you march with. The kind you earn by standing tall when the world tries to make you small. Marian didn't go straight back to Atlanta after the funeral. She stayed behind in Montgomery for a few days, longer than anyone expected. She said it was to settle a few things. But truth be told, it wasn't about logistics or paperwork. It was about breath. About being able to walk down streets where she wasn't invisible, where folks still called her Miss Marian, even if they hadn't seen her in 40 years. It was about not hearing the low mechanical groan of an airport escalator, or the sterile voice of a TSA agent calling her ma'am, like she was a problem to be managed. Montgomery still remembered. The little white church off Hall Street still had the same wooden pews where she and David sat on the left side every Sunday. The corner diner still served grits with too much butter. And though time had chipped away at most of the neighborhood, some things remained, stubborn like the roots of a live oak. On the third day, she visited the house where she grew up. The paint was peeling. The screen door hung off one hinge. Nobody lived there anymore, not since her cousin Clara passed. But Marian stepped onto the porch and sat in the exact same spot where David had once leaned against the railing in his army uniform and told her he couldn't imagine dying without her name in his mouth. She didn't cry. She just sat. Let the sun warm her knees and the wind remind her she still had skin. Sometimes, memory wasn't about reliving, it was about re-inhabiting. Breathing the same air. Smelling the same earth. Letting the past stretch its legs inside the present. But peace never stays long when you're black and still breathing in America. On the fifth day, Marian's niece, Cynthia, a sharp and fiery woman in her 40s, offered to drive her to the train station. "No more planes, Auntie," Cynthia said. "You've earned the right to sit still and look out the window while someone else does the flying." Marian agreed, half laughing. "Long as the train don't ask me what's in my bag, I'll be fine." They packed her things, folded the funeral dress into tissue, and wrapped the urn in an old quilt David's mother had made. "He'd want to ride in something soft," Marian said. The station was small, unassuming, and mostly quiet, except for a group of teens hovering near the vending machines and a white station manager behind a desk who glanced up only when he noticed Marian being helped by a woman much younger and better dressed. That look. The same damn look she'd seen 100 times. The quiet scanning. The unspoken math. How does someone like her know someone like that? While Cynthia sorted the tickets, Marian waited alone on a bench. The urn rested beside her, quilt-wrapped, looking more like a bundle of laundry than the final remnants of a life. A janitor pushing a mop paused and asked, "That your baby in there?" She looked up, startled. "No," she said. "That's my husband." The janitor nodded solemnly and kept moving. No questions. No judgment. Just a silent acknowledgement between the living and the grieving. But not everyone was so gentle. As Marian made her way to the boarding platform, a security guard, young, white, impatient, stepped in her path. "Ma'am, I'm gonna need to see what's in that bundle." Marian blinked. "Excuse me?" "Random inspection," he said. "You can't board with unscanned packages." Cynthia stepped in fast, voice firm. "She's already been cleared. We have paperwork." The guard didn't look at her. He only looked at Marian. "You carrying anything metallic?" Marian's hands clenched. "Only my husband." "What?" the guard asked, confused. Cynthia reached into her purse and pulled out a clear folder of documents. Cremation certificate, TSA form, death certificate. But the guard waved it off. "Still need to see it." Marian's voice lowered into that steel-thin register older women used when they were done being nice. "Son, you can ask nicely, or you can step aside." The tension crackled. People nearby started watching. A white woman clutched her handbag tighter. A man in a blazer pulled out his phone and began to film. Again. Always someone filming, never someone intervening. The guard hesitated. He'd read about the story, seen her face in a tweet someone sent around the office. "You're the lady from the airport, ain't you?" he asked, as if that changed anything. "I am," she said, calm as still water. "And you're about to be the next one who makes a fool of yourself." At that moment, a supervisor, older, tired-looking, black, came over fast, eyes already apologizing. "Mrs. Williams," he said, "so sorry for the delay. Please go ahead. We'll make sure your seat is ready." The guard stepped back. No apology, no lowered eyes, just retreat. On the train, Marian sat by the window again. Cynthia stayed long enough to help her settle, then kissed her cheek. "Call me when you get in. Don't let anyone mess with you." "They keep trying," Marian said, "but I've outlived worse." The train pulled out slowly, wheels grinding over tracks laid down long before either of them was born. As trees passed like sentinels, Marian found herself thinking not about the funeral or the urn, but about how many black women had spent their whole lives being told to justify their presence. How many funerals had been interrupted by suspicion. How many trips turned into lessons in patience. She wasn't angry. Not exactly. Anger was too easy, too hot. What she felt was more dangerous, more enduring. She felt resolve, a hardening, a silent, ancient promise to every woman who ever carried memory through a world that wanted to forget her. When the conductor passed through to check tickets, he paused and looked at the urn. "That a family heirloom?" he asked, polite but curious. "You could say that," Marian said. "He fought for this country, came back with holes in his body and a smile still on his face. Gave me 2 boys and a life full of laughter. That urn holds more than ashes. It holds every damn reason I never gave up." The conductor touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, that's the kind of story I wish more folks heard." "Maybe they will," she said, her eyes still on the trees rushing past. "Maybe next time they'll ask before assuming." The ride was smooth. She dozed a little, dreamed of David in his younger years, shirt off in the backyard, fixing the old Buick. Dreamed of their boys, chasing fireflies in the summer with jars and giggles. When she woke, they were pulling into the next city. People gathered their things. A little boy pointed at the urn and asked, "Is that a treasure?" Marian smiled. "Yes," she said, "the greatest kind." The boy's mother looked embarrassed, but Marian waved it off. "He's right to ask. This world don't ask enough." And as the train slowed, she sat straighter, wore her grief like armor, because she wasn't just carrying a husband. She was carrying a history, a witness, a whole country's reckoning in a bundle no bigger than a football. And every time someone tried to make her explain herself, she did. With pride, with patience, with power. Because Marian Williams wasn't just traveling. She was marching, not with feet, but with memory, with presence, with the unwavering refusal to shrink. Marian arrived back in Atlanta just before sunset, the city skyline cutting the horizon in jagged silence, as the train slowed to a crawl and eased into the station. She was tired, but not in the way people meant when they said it. This wasn't about her age, her bones, or the long trip home. It was a deeper kind of fatigue, the kind you carry in your spirit when the world demands too much for too long. The kind that builds not from miles traveled, but from dignity bruised over and over again in places where it should have been protected. She stepped off the train with her small suitcase in one hand and the urn wrapped in that old quilt tucked in the crook of her arm like a sleeping child. People moved past her quickly, the way they always do in stations, heads down, earbuds in, rushing toward whatever came next. None of them knew what she carried. None of them asked. None of them saw. The Uber driver waiting outside didn't get out of the car, just popped the trunk and tapped at his phone. When she opened the door and sat down, he glanced at her only once. "Airport?" he asked, then back to his screen. "No," Marian said. "Home." And then after a pause, "For both of us." He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't look again, just pulled into traffic and turned up the radio. Some song with too much bass and not enough meaning. Atlanta rolled by her window in a blur of neon and noise. Gentrified corners where old churches used to be. brew pubs where barbershops once stood, new glass buildings stacked where families had been priced out. She hardly recognized her own city anymore. And in a way, she understood that she too had become unfamiliar. Just another old woman carrying stories no one had the patience to hear. But she hadn't always been someone people overlooked. In the 70s, she'd been the voice in the neighborhood council meetings that people listened to. She'd organized free lunch programs, lobbied the school board for fair textbooks, fought landlords who tried to push black tenants out under the table. David used to say she had fire behind the smile. And Lord, he wasn't wrong. But fire cools over time. Not because it dies, but because it learns to burn quiet, controlled, strategic. Marian had learned how to survive in a world that smiled while ignoring you. That meant knowing when to raise your voice and when to let silence say more. That ride home was one of those silent moments. She stared out the window while the city flashed by, gripping the urn not out of fear, but out of something harder to explain, something like possession. As if every jolt of the road might shake loose another piece of memory she wasn't ready to surrender. When the car pulled up to her street, the driver didn't offer to help, just waited, engine humming, until she opened her door and stepped out. Marian didn't mind. She'd carried heavier things alone. Her house sat just where it always had, brick and brown, a bit more weathered than she remembered. The lawn was overgrown, the mailbox leaning slightly to the left like it was tired too, but the porch light still worked. She stepped up slowly, reached under the faded mat for the spare key, and let herself in. Inside, the air smelled of dust and waiting, the kind of scent that clings to places where nothing has stirred for too long. She didn't turn on the lights right away. Let the dimness wrap around her like a shawl. She moved through the rooms with the kind of reverence one gives to sacred ground, her steps echoing on the wooden floors. The house was quiet, but not empty. His presence was everywhere, in the framed photo on the hallway wall, in the old recliner still angled toward the TV, in the way her fingers automatically reached for the second coffee cup even though she hadn't brewed 2 cups in months. Marian placed the urn on the fireplace mantel, just beneath the framed American flag folded in its triangle case. "You're home," she whispered. "Really home now." But even as she said it, she felt the weight settle deeper in her chest. Because home wasn't just a place. It was a person. And without him, this house was just drywall and memory. The next morning, she woke up early, not because she had to, but because sleep had stopped coming easy in recent years. She brewed coffee the old way, boiling the water on the stove and pouring it slowly through the same ceramic filter they'd used for decades. No fancy machines, just patience and habit. The urn remained where she'd left it, and she paused in front of it, holding her mug with both hands, steam curling into her face. "They think we're done," she said aloud. "But they're wrong." She wasn't sure who they were in that moment, maybe TSA, maybe time itself. Maybe every man who ever called her sweetheart with condescension or tried to explain her own life to her. But the words felt necessary, like drawing a line in the sand. Later that afternoon, she decided to visit the community center on 14th Street. It had been years, but something told her she needed to see what had become of the place. She took the bus, like she used to before her knees got bad, and nodded politely at the driver. Inside, the walls still bore the same faded posters about voter registration and after-school tutoring, but now there were new faces behind the front desk. Young, eager, eyes full of ideas. They didn't recognize her, of course. Why would they? To them, she was just another elder, another relic. She introduced herself softly, and when she mentioned her full name, one of the young women, a college student interning for the summer, paused. "Wait," she said. "I've read about you. The airport video. You're her." Marian smiled faintly. "I'm me," she said. "And I was before the video too." The girl flushed. "I didn't mean..." "It's all right," Marian said. "But don't just remember the video. Remember why it mattered." They asked her to speak at the upcoming Veterans Appreciation event. She declined at first, said she was too tired, too busy, too everything. But as she walked home that evening, a thought tugged at her. David would have said yes. Not because he liked attention, he hated speeches, but because he believed in testimony. You don't bury the truth, he used to say. You carry it until someone else is ready to lift it too. So the next day, Marian called the center and told them she'd speak. But only if she could speak plain. No teleprompters. No pre-approved talking points. Just her truth. Tell them I'm not here to inspire, she said. I'm here to remind. And as she hung up the phone, something settled inside her. Not peace. That would take more time. But maybe a beginning. Maybe something like a return. Not to the woman she was, but to the woman who still remained. Not broken. Not reduced. But sharpened by everything she'd endured. A witness. A keeper. A fire that learned to burn quiet but never out. The night before the event at the community center, Marian stood in her kitchen with the window open, letting the summer air drift in like an old song. The lights inside were soft, the kind of light that didn't try too hard. The urn still rested on the mantel, watching over her like David used to from the porch swing. She hadn't talked to him aloud in a few days, not because she'd forgotten him, but because the grief had shifted. It no longer screamed. Now it hummed. A steady low presence that followed her from room to room, not cruelly, just constantly. She stood over the kitchen sink peeling an apple, the knife gliding slow and sure. She wasn't nervous about speaking tomorrow. Nervous wasn't the right word. She was aware of eyes, of attention, of how quickly people turned grief into performance. But she wasn't here to perform. She was here to reckon. When she showed up at the center the next morning, they had a chair waiting for her on stage. Folded metal, no cushion. That felt right. Comfortable wasn't what this was about. She sat down, urn wrapped in the same quilt across her lap, and watched the room fill. Mostly older men, some in uniform, some in t-shirts that read Vietnam Veteran or Operation Desert Storm. Faces lined by sun and sorrow, hands that twitched slightly when the air conditioning kicked on too hard. This was not a room that needed inspiration. This was a room that had seen things and didn't always talk about them. Some were here for the coffee and free donuts. Some were here because they'd heard about her. Most were here because they didn't know where else to be. The program opened with a few formalities. A prayer, a pledge, a song sung a little off-key by a local high schooler whose voice cracked but heart didn't. Then the young woman from the front desk came up and introduced Marian with more words than necessary. Something about courage and strength and dignity. Marian didn't flinch, but in her mind, she heard David say, "You ain't no statue. Just tell the damn truth." So when they handed her the mic, she didn't clear her throat or read from notes. She just began. "I'm not here to give a speech," she said. "I'm here because something happened to me, and I'm tired of pretending it was surprising." The room went still. A few veterans nodded slowly, their eyes sharpening. "Most of y'all know what happened by now. That video of me at the airport. Me and my husband's ashes getting treated like a threat. That clip got passed around like gossip, shared like it was a shock. But let me ask you something. Was it really that shocking?" She paused. To be a black woman in this country and be mistaken for danger, even in grief, was that new? A few murmurs. Cough from the back. She went on. David Williams was drafted at 21. Sent to Vietnam before he could vote. Came back with shrapnel in his hip and nightmares he never described. He wasn't no hero statue in the park. He was a man who got up every morning and went to work, even when his bones hurt like fire. He paid his taxes, loved one woman, raised 2 boys, and taught them how to carry themselves like they mattered. And when he died, I wrapped what was left of him in a quilt his mother made, and I tried to bring him home. Her voice didn't crack, but it deepened. They stopped me, because I was holding an urn, because it was metallic, because it was me. She held the urn higher then, just a little so they could see it. This right here, this ain't just dust. This is service. This is loyalty. This is the cost of believing in a country that doesn't always believe back. Now the room was silent in a different way. Not discomfort, reverence. And I'm not here to make anybody feel guilty. I've buried too many years for that. I'm here because I need y'all to remember what we carried. Not just in war, but after. Every time we got called boy in our own uniforms. Every time we had to walk around the back door of a diner still wearing our medals. Every time they told us, wait your turn. And our turn never came. She scanned the crowd slowly. The Navy vet from the plane was sitting near the front. He had tears in his eyes. He didn't wipe them. I'm here because someone younger than you, some TSA officer who don't know better, thought I was dangerous for loving too hard, for mourning too long, for carrying a black man's legacy through a metal detector. And I'm here to say no more of that. Someone clapped once, then a few more. Then the room burst open like a seam giving way under pressure. But she raised a hand gently and they quieted again. I don't need applause, she said. I need memory. I need y'all to remember each other, to tell the stories while we're still breathing, not when we're boxes in the ground. I need the folks who've served this country to understand that the fight didn't end overseas. Came home with us. It followed us into classrooms, job interviews, squad cars, and security checkpoints. And if we don't say that out loud, they'll write history without us. When she finished, she didn't sit down right away. She stood for a moment longer, looking out over the crowd as if trying to see all the versions of David who might have been sitting there. All the men who came home and were never quite welcomed back. Then she walked off stage and sat beside the urn again, hands folded in her lap, steady. Afterward, men came up to her in waves. Some offered thanks. Some offered stories. One man said, they did the same to my wife in '89, at the courthouse, treated her like she didn't belong. Another whispered, my grandson's afraid to wear his uniform out in public, says it don't mean anything anymore. And one simply looked at her and said, I saw you. I see you. She nodded to each one, not because she had answers, but because she knew how much it meant to be heard. Later that night, back home, Marian lit a candle by the urn and sat on the couch in her robe. No music, no distractions, just silence and that soft flickering glow. You'd have hated that chair, she murmured. No cushion, made my hip ache something fierce. Then she laughed. A full, open laugh she hadn't let out in weeks. But you'd have been proud. You would have said I was too polite, but you'd have been proud. Outside, the crickets started singing. The city wound down. And inside, in that little brick house with the leaning mailbox and the peeling paint, Marian Williams sat still and whole, not waiting to be saved, not begging to be seen, but holding the line. Not just for herself, not just for David, but for everyone who ever had to prove they were worth mourning. Marian didn't expect the story to travel the way it did. She thought maybe a few folks in the neighborhood would talk about the speech, pass her name around church circles, maybe even invite her to speak at some small gathering of Gold Star families or widow support groups. But what happened next was something else entirely. A clip, just a shaky phone video, nothing polished, of her standing on that stage with the urn tucked in her lap and her voice cutting through the room like a knife through linen started making its way online. Someone uploaded it to Facebook. Then it made its way to Twitter. Then the local news picked it up. Then national news. By the end of the week, Marian was getting calls from networks she didn't recognize and invitations to sit on morning talk shows with glossy couches and lights that never dimmed. She said no to all of them. I ain't going on TV to become some mascot for outrage, she told her friend Lillian over the phone one night. This ain't about pity. It's about truth. Still, people kept showing up at her church, outside the grocery store, in the waiting room at the VA. Some came just to say thank you. Others brought their own stories like offerings at her feet. A man in his 80s approached her outside the post office, held out a yellowed photo of himself in a uniform and said, they never gave me a flag. You said what I couldn't. A young Latina woman with a child on her hip handed Marian a handwritten note that read, you reminded me my grandma's voice still matters. Marian listened to them all, even when it was hard. Even when it felt like every word pulled something loose inside her that had barely begun to settle. She didn't try to go viral. She didn't post daily reflections or pose with the urn for attention. All she did was speak plainly, and somehow that was more revolutionary than anything else. In a world that spun faster every day, Marian became an anchor for people hungry to slow down and feel. And what she gave them, without ever meaning to, was permission to grieve, to speak, to remember. But all that attention came with something else too. Something quieter. A kind of shift. A ripple in places she thought would never change. 2 weeks after the community center speech, Marian received a letter. Not an email. A real letter. Cream-colored envelope. Handwritten return address. Washington, D.C. It was from the Department of Homeland Security. She opened it at the kitchen table with trembling fingers, half expecting more bureaucracy. What she read, instead, stopped her cold. It was an official apology, not the bland, corporate kind, but one that mentioned her by name. A recognition of what had happened. A statement that what she endured was unacceptable. But more than that, it said the department was launching a full internal review of TSA training regarding funeral transport, cultural sensitivity, and de-escalation procedures. Marian read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it beside the urn. "You hear that?" she said, looking up. "Took him long enough." But they finally said it out loud. The next morning, she received a phone call. This time, she answered. It was the regional TSA director for the Southeast. He wanted to meet her. She said yes. Not because she wanted anything from him, but because she wanted him to look her in the eye. She wore a dark blue dress. The one David had always said brought out the steel in her voice. They met at a federal office building in downtown Atlanta, where the flags outside hung still in the muggy air. The director was a white man in his early 50s, gray at the temples, shoulders tight. He stood when she entered, extended a hand. "Mrs. Williams, thank you for coming. I want to start by saying..." Marian held up a hand. "Don't start with the script. Just talk to me like a person." He nodded, cleared his throat, and said, "I'm sorry for what happened. It wasn't right. We failed you." Marian said nothing at first, just looked at him, hard. "You didn't just fail me," she said. "You failed a man who served this country and asked for nothing but dignity in return. And you failed everyone who's been through security holding something sacred and got treated like a criminal." He listened, really listened. And that, more than anything, was what made her keep talking. "Your agents need to know that not everything in a bag is a threat. Sometimes it's a father. Sometimes it's a child. Sometimes it's all someone's got left." The meeting lasted 40 minutes. When she left, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt steady, like something had been set down that she no longer needed to carry alone. A few days later, a press release confirmed the new TSA training protocol, set to begin within the year. The story reached farther than she imagined. Veteran groups issued statements of support. A national funeral service organization offered to provide free shipping for cremated remains for any veteran's family. And the airport where it all started? They named a quiet corner in Terminal B, the memory room. A space with soft chairs. A bookshelf of remembrance journals. A place for people to pause. When Marian visited it for the first time, she ran her hand along the edge of the wall and read the small plaque that hung near the door. It said, "In memory of David L. Williams and all those who carried love through metal detectors." She sat down in one of the chairs and looked around. A young woman nearby held a wooden box and wiped tears from her eyes. Marian didn't say a word, just reached into her bag, pulled out a packet of tissues, and handed it over. The woman took them with a soft, grateful nod. Sometimes that was all you needed to do: show up, be still, let grief breathe. Back at home that evening, Marian made herself tea and turned on the porch light even though she wasn't expecting company. She sat on the swing with the urn beside her, wrapped now not in the old quilt, but in a new flag one of her grandsons had folded for her after watching her speech online. "You see all this?" she said to the urn. "You always told me to keep going, even when I didn't want to. Well, I did, and we changed something. Maybe not everything, but something." The wind stirred the leaves in the yard, and for a moment she thought of the day he came home from Vietnam. Skin thinner, eyes older, but heart still wide open. She thought of how he held her waist like it was the only thing keeping him from floating away. She thought of how he used to hum when he fixed the screen door, how he kissed her hand when he couldn't find the right words. Marian Williams wasn't looking to be remembered. She wasn't trying to be history. She was trying to carry a man home. And in doing so, she helped carry a nation a little further toward remembering itself. Not with rage, not with noise, but with truth so steady it could not be ignored. And as the sun dipped below the trees and the light turned golden across the porch, she smiled softly. A quiet thing, the kind that only comes when you know you've kept your promise. Not just to the man you loved, but to everyone still waiting to be seen. A few weeks passed quietly. The story cooled like all stories do. News cycles moved on. The hashtags slowed. Interviews stopped coming. But Marian didn't mind. She'd never wanted to be a headline. She didn't need to ride a wave. What she wanted was already here. A kind of settled justice, not the loud kind with banners and speeches, but the deeper kind that comes when your truth has been heard and someone somewhere decides they won't let it happen again. That was enough. It was a warm Thursday morning when she decided to visit David's resting place again. She took the quilt off the urn the day before and finally placed him into the ground. Just the way he wanted, beside his father, beneath a wide pecan tree that had outlived 3 storms and most of the men buried beneath it. There'd been no ceremony this time. No rifles. No flags. Just her, a quiet wind, and a pastor from the church who came more to listen than to preach. Now, days later, she returned not to mourn, but to talk. She brought a thermos of black coffee, a folding chair, and a photo from 1965. David in his army greens, crooked grin on his face, Marian wearing a scarf tied high and smiling like she'd just been told she was beautiful for the first time. She sat and poured a cup, placed the photo on the ground near the headstone and sipped. "You'd like what they did," she said, half smiling. "TSA's reworking their rules. Officers are getting trained by folks who've actually been through what we have. And they've got that little memory room now. For people like me. For people like you." The wind moved the grass gently, as if answering. "Still, I won't lie. I wish you'd been there to see it. The way those men clapped. The way that officer couldn't speak when I looked him in the eye. You always told me not to make a fuss, but even you would have stood up for this one." She leaned back, staring up at the sky. A hawk circled overhead. "You know what surprised me most?" she said after a pause. "It wasn't the apology. It wasn't the attention. It was the way people who never met you started writing letters. Veterans from states we never set foot in. Young folks, too. Mixed kids who said they never knew a black woman could make change just by standing her ground and telling the truth. One even called me a patriot. Can you imagine that?" She chuckled, wiped the edge of her mouth with a napkin. "They asked me if I'd travel, speak to other groups. I said no, mostly, but I did agree to one thing." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small velvet box. "I'm giving your story to a museum. Not your ashes, don't worry. Just your uniform and that photo. They said they're building a section on unsung veterans. I figured it was time someone knew what you carried. What we carried." She stood up then, walked a slow circle around the grave, fingers trailing along the stone's edge. "You know, after all these years, I finally get what you meant when you said, 'We don't get statues, baby. We get memories.'" She stopped and placed her palm flat on the warm granite. "But we're changing that, aren't we? One memory at a time." The wind picked up, the tree leaves rustling like they were whispering back. That evening, back home, Marian sat on her porch again. She wasn't alone this time. Her oldest son had come by to check on her, bringing 2 of the grandkids with him. One of them, the youngest, sat cross-legged on the floor of the porch, sketching with crayons. "What you drawing, sweet pea?" Marian asked. The girl held up a page. Plain. A lady with gray hair. A man in a uniform made of green and stars. "This you," the girl said proudly. "And Grandpa David. And the airport that was mean but then got nice." Marian stared at the drawing, something catching in her throat. "Can I keep that?" The girl nodded. "I made it for you." Her son stepped up behind her, placed a hand on her shoulder. "You know, Ma," he said, "you didn't just carry him home. You carried all of us." She looked up at him, tears threatening but held back. I just didn't want him to be forgotten, she said. You made sure none of us will be, he replied. The stars came out that night without clouds. The porch light buzzed softly behind them, and as Marian leaned back into the creaking swing, she closed her eyes for a long moment, listening to the night. Not for David's voice. He was beyond needing to speak now, but for the quiet confirmation that he was still with her, in the wind, in the drawing, in the way her family sat around her without needing permission. What began as a confrontation at a security checkpoint became something far greater than she ever imagined. Not a movement, not a trend, but a reckoning. A reminder that dignity doesn't expire with age. That love, when carried faithfully, becomes its own kind of resistance. She didn't need to be famous. She didn't need anyone to call her brave. She just needed the world to see what she saw, that a black woman with an urn in her hands and a husband in her heart could walk through fire and come out holding history in her arms. And maybe, just maybe, because of her, the next time a widow walked alone through a crowded terminal, someone would see her not as a delay or a threat, but as a monument. A moving one, built not of stone or bronze, but of love, memory, and the unshakable courage it takes to carry someone home and keep carrying them long after the world says you're done.